Jacobean England. We call it Jacobean because Jacobus is the Latin version of James. So when you see Jacobean, it basically just means connected with James. It's used here to connect with James I, but later on it's used to refer to later Jameses of the Stuart family, especially those who were not king or queen, but wanted to become king in the late 17th and early 18th century. So Jacobean England, for our purposes now, is the reign of King James. He was the first James of England, but he was James VI of Scotland. So sometimes you'll see him referred to as James VI inside the Scottish context. His accession, okay, how he began to be king, we'll start with that. And as you remember, I've tried to emphasize that Henry VII's daughter married the King of Scotland, leading through the generations to James. Notice who his mother was. It's another of those situations, isn't it, where the English are saying, you know, like, sorry, we did chop her head off, but would you like to be our king? And he says, that's really easy one. Partly because he never really knew his mother. Okay, he didn't grow up with her. He didn't really know his mother very well anyway. If he had known her more, he might have been a bit more upset that she'd had her head chopped off by the English. But since he didn't really know her, I guess it didn't matter quite so much to him. Now, yeah. So it's Henry VIII's sister here, the daughter of Henry VII, who is married James IV of Scotland, and then Elizabeth dies. Okay, first Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth die, and there are no children. So basically, the Tudor line dies out. And so the nearest relative is James. This was agreed on before Elizabeth died, because they wanted to have it clear who's going to be the next king. In England, when the king or queen dies, they say, the king is dead, God save the king, meaning the next one, because it's already decided. There's no time when there isn't a king. So the king is dead, God save the king. In this case, it would mean the queen is dead, God save the king. All right? Meaning the next one. And England and Wales, of course, had already been united for, since the Middle Ages. And also, Henry in 1542 had declared that Ireland was controlled by England, and Ireland was England's first Shokuminchi, first colony. So that had been going on in the Middle Ages, and it was sort of made official, in his way of thinking at least, by Henry VIII. And Scotland didn't actually formally unite until much later. And it's after 1707 that I would, if I was teaching you that period, I wouldn't be talking about England so much anymore. I'd be talking about Britain or the United Kingdom, because it would all have been brought together as one country. Ireland didn't actually join the United Kingdom until, again, 100 years after that. But basically, the countries were much, much closer in the 17th century than they had been 100 years earlier. Especially Scotland had been pretty much a kind of enemy of England until the later part of the 16th century. And then when James became king, in effect, they still had two governments, they were still two different countries, but they had the same king. And so, in lots of ways, they functioned as one country. So, Question of religion continues to be very important in this time. And what have we got here? It continued to be important, of course, and James himself had a very strong attitude towards it. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of his attitude towards religion was that he considered himself to be king by divine right. So this idea of divine right, please catch on to that. That's an important idea that we will be coming back to several times. Okay, divine right. And it basically means, divine means from God. And right basically means kingly, his right to be. What he understood from this was his right to be king comes not from humans, but from God. He is king because God wants him to be king. Okay? And this creates problems in the end because it means that he doesn't listen to people. God chose me, I don't have to listen to you guys. Okay? I'm king because God wants me to be king. So this is going to lead to problems. The Bible, of course, from Henry's time, the Bible had been available in English, but the version of the Bible that I grew up with still was the King James Bible, and this is still the most famous version of the Bible. When people want to make quotations from the Bible, they'll usually use this version. Okay? There were other Bibles before that. We talked about the translation of the Bible, Tyndale, in the period of Henry VIII, and more. There was also a Catholic translation came out eventually in the 16th century. Basically, though, this is the translation that we all love. It's written in the same kind of English as Shakespeare used, and it has the same kind of poetry to it. And it's got a wonderful sound to it, a wonderful feeling to it. When the New English Bible came out, they kind of updated it and put it all in more modern English. Like, I was just thinking, it's taken all the poetry out of it. It's taken the magic, I'm not religious, you see, so I don't especially think of it from it's wonderful poetry. And so that was the standard version of the Bible for hundreds of years, and it was authorized by King James. He ordered this translation to be made. Now, because of the family history of the Stuarts, remember his mother had been a Catholic, they knew that he wasn't a Catholic and that he was going to be the head of the Church of England as Elizabeth had run it, but they were hoping that he would be more sympathetic towards the Catholics, and he wasn't. In fact, he was pretty strict with both ends of the spectrum. Remember, the Church of England, which we often call the C of E, was a spectrum, and on this side you've got Catholics outside the spectrum, and on this side you've got Puritans outside the spectrum. And he tried to, encourage people, say, look, let's try and make the church as broad as we can. If we make it a little bit broader, will you come in? Will you join us? And that policy that had started with Elizabeth, that policy more or less continued with James, but he was pretty strict with those people who wouldn't fit in, Catholics or Puritans. He was strict on both sides. And disappointment with that on the Catholic side led to the gunpowder plot. And we'll talk about the gunpowder plot later on today. Okay, that's a separate topic. But basically, it was a plot by Catholics to kill the king. A very famous plot, and so I'll talk about it later on after I've been through James's life. I'll present it as a separate topic. And again, both Catholics and Puritans were disappointed. Puritans had a hard time here. Extreme Puritans, I think in my picture of suffering at that time, I showed Puritans from this time getting their ears chopped off or their tongue cut out or horrible things like that being done to them because they wouldn't accept the strict teaching of the church. So he was strict on both sides. Okay, there you go, James. Among other things, James was a scholar, a little bit of an academic. And he published a number of books. We've got half a dozen or so books that he published. Notice this one, for example, A Counterblast to Tobacco. He hated tobacco, which had been introduced recently from America, and he was very much against it. He wrote a book against tobacco, trying to show the medical reasons and all the different reasons why tobacco was a bad thing. Turns out he was right, more correct about that than he was about some other things. Now this, an apology for the Oath of Allegiance. The Oath of Allegiance was where people had to promise that they were true to the king and that they accepted the king. And so he's writing a paper explaining why they have to make that promise. Okay, showing all the research into history and the law, political reasons why that promise needed to be made by people. Especially if, nobody could work in public office. Remember in Queen Elizabeth's time it was the same. If you're going to work in a public position, you had to make this kind of promise that you were true to the Queen and that you were basically that you were not Catholic or anything like that. So the Oath of Allegiance, but there are several books like this that he wrote, some of them more academic than others. We've got political tracts, we've got a treatise opposing the use of tobacco, we've got a whole range of things here. And I just want to pick out one of them and take a closer look at that. Because he wrote a book on witches, okay, demonology. This is something, again, when we're thinking about how these people were different from us, they really believed that some people were witches. Some people were Yamamoto-Wilson, servants of the devil. And they had this idea, and those people had to be killed. You find them, you kill them. In the Bible it says, never suffer a witch to live. So the Bible also talks about witches, and you have to kill them. So it was part of their following the Bible that they thought, if you find someone who is a witch, you have to kill them. And quite a lot of people were killed at this time, as we shall see, for supposedly being witches. So, it's written by the Prince James, as you can just see, the high and mighty Prince James, who is by grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, they put in. They don't even bother putting Wales in, because Wales is already it's Atarimae. They take it for granted that it's part of England. And when they say France, it's not all of France, it's just a small part of France that at this stage still belongs to England. And yes, he wrote this book on witches. So James and witchcraft is quite a topic, an important topic for us. Demonology is a book about witches. Like many people at that time, James believed that there really were people who worshipped the devil and cast harmful spells on people. Some 4,000 to 6,000 people are believed to have been put to death as witches in Scotland during the 16th and 17th centuries, and about 1,000 in England. So many more in Scotland. Okay, and he was, of course, Scottish. So he came with a very strong idea of witches. The population of Scotland was much smaller than the population of England, but the number of witches, or people punished as witches, was much greater. Okay, so it was a much bigger thing in Scotland than in England. And this brings us back to Shakespeare in an interesting way, because okay, he also writes about witches. Does anybody know which play has 3 witches in it? Which Shakespeare play? I know you're not students of literature, but does anybody know that? You're right, Macbeth has got the 3 witches. In fact, it starts with 3 witches like this, making a plot to meet Macbeth, and they will tell him his future. And they tell him that he's going to become the king. And you know, if I was sort of walking around one day and some witches came along and said, you know, hey, you're going to be king, I would say, great, you know, let's watch it, let's see it happen. But Macbeth doesn't do this. Macbeth thinks, oh, they said I'm going to be king, so I guess I have to do something about it. So he kills the king. Okay, well, they didn't tell him he had to kill anybody, but he you know, takes that path, and of course he ends up losing his head and is kicked out. So it's a story about Macbeth as a bad Scottish king. Now, Macbeth is a true story. I mean, there really was a king of Scotland called Macbeth, and the witches is all rubbish, of course, that doesn't happen. But he actually was a very good king. But Shakespeare writes about him as a bad king because he wants to tell the story of the history of James's family, and in going a long way back, he makes the story of James's family killed, or a member of James's family killed Macbeth, the bad king. So he wrote this story to keep James happy. He wrote it just after James became king and presented it to the king, and it was to please the king in 2 ways. One, the king likes, you know, the king believes in witches, let's give him witches, okay? And the second one was, let's give him a story where his ancestors in the past come out as the heroes. Okay, so he takes a true historical story and he twists it around to make it suitable for the new king. All right, so one of the most famous scenes in Shakespeare is the 3 witches, and as I say, Macbeth was a real person based on Macbeth in Holinshead. Do you remember I talked about Holinshead last week or a week or 2 ago, saying that this history was used by Shakespeare frequently in his writings? So he uses Holinshead's work, and Holinshead has no witches in his story. Shakespeare just put them in to keep James happy, and of course to make the story more exciting. Okay, now this idea of witches was very popular in the 17th century. Both men and women were accused of being witches, but mostly it was women. And modern understanding of it is that, you know, it was a form of early modern prejudice against women, or even hatred and fear of women. And that part of that goes back to the Bible. Any idea why? Okay? Do you want to find out? Huh? Yeah, okay, yeah. She's reading ahead in the Prince, okay? So, yeah. It's the Garden of Eden and Eve and that sort of thing, yeah. So, yeah, there's Eve in the Bible. She's the one who takes the apple, all right? The story of Eve, the first woman being tempted by a snake in the Garden of Eden. Eve eats the forbidden fruit and gives it to Adam, the first man, to eat. So it's through Eve that man loses his position in the Garden of Eden, in paradise. And so partly because of this story, women in the early modern period were often considered to be naturally more evil than men. All right, there are quite a lot of books written about it. The only thing women are good at is being bad. Okay, there was some books are really tremendous hatred towards women. And you remember what I said? Feminism and women's position in society is not a straight line. It went down in this period. And we'll notice some interesting things about this 17th century especially. But compared to the medieval period, women's position in society actually went down at this time. Partly because of religion and the Protestant way of understanding the Bible. So talking about women, it didn't help that James I was probably homosexual. Now, these witch hunts, as I say, they're usually seen as a form of misogyny, prejudice against women or hatred of women, even though men also could be accused of being witches. It was nearly always women. And it's not clear whether James hated or despised women himself, but he didn't seem to do anything to stop this popular anti-woman kind of feeling. He did get married and he did have three children, but most historians consider that he was at least bisexual and probably basically homosexual. Okay, this was kind of very noticeable at the time as well. This is his wife, and he had 3 children by her. Anne of Denmark. But there was a Latin epigram. Epigrams are like short, kind of like not exactly a proverb, but well, some epigrams are like proverbs. But basically, it's saying Elizabeth was king, and now James is queen. Okay? Rex fuit Elizabeth nunc est regina Jacobus. So this kind of thing was going around as a popular kind of comment. She was a dancing woman, masculine woman, and he's a jose man, a feminine man. So, or effeminated man. So that kind of thing was being said at the time. Certainly there was some of the young men in the court would seem to be very, very close to him. And it seems likely that he was basically homosexual. So, it really matters very much, but it may help to explain some of the anti-woman feeling of the period. I don't know. But anyway, that's part of James. And okay, I'll move on now to international relations and England's relationship. Remember, we started in the beginning of the Tudor period. England was a very basically unimportant country. Then there were these big international marriages with Spain and things like that. Lots of people from different countries wanting to marry Elizabeth. England beating Spain in the Spanish Armada, and the country developing its trading, developing its navy, becoming more and more of a powerful nation. Now, James was pretty good at keeping England out of some of the nasty wars that were going on in Europe at the time. Thank goodness, because those wars were pretty useless, didn't do any good to Europe. I don't know if you remember, but although England beat Spain in the Battle of the Armada, defeating the Armada, the war with Spain carried on, and he stopped that when he became king. And also, he made a plan for a marriage with the youngest daughter of the King of Spain and his own son, Charles. And this is called the Spanish match. And for several years, it seemed like, oh yeah, our young Charles is going to marry Maria Ana, the Spanish princess. So that helped to keep the peace between the two countries. Didn't work out in the end, but we'll talk about that later on. Actually, no, we're going to talk about it fairly immediately, because it took a number of years of debating the topic, and just as had happened before with Mary, it wasn't popular with Parliament, mainly because, or partly at least, because Maria Anna, of course, was a Catholic. The idea of the future King Charles marrying a Catholic was kind of difficult for the English people by this stage. They had a clearly defined Protestant identity, and they wanted to keep it. So marrying a Catholic seemed like a bad idea. So it wasn't popular, and it was going on and on and on. So Charles said, that's enough. I'm not going to keep on waiting for the politicians and the arguments. I'm going to get on my horse and I'm going to go off to Spain. Well, I think he would have gone by ship, I suppose, for the first part of the journey, but he would arrive like a shining knight in armor on his horse, and well, unfortunately, she hated him. Okay, didn't work at all. As soon as she saw him, she thought, "Ooh, I'm not marrying him." We often think that the marriages were forced in those days, but she was so clear that she was not going to marry this man that the Spanish match had to be broken off. All right, he arrived on his shining horse, but like a knight, in the old romances, and it just didn't work at all. She wasn't interested. So then, yes, the war that James kept England out of, the 30 Years' War, was a very ugly power struggle going on in Europe. Now, he was involved, really. James could have got involved in this 30-year war because his daughter, Elizabeth, had married what was called the Elector Palatine. This was lower than a king. You have to think that in these days, Germany especially, but much of Europe, was not one united country. And Germany was divided into lots of smaller little kingdoms. So was Italy, so were several parts of Europe. And Frederick was at that time the Elector Palatine, which was lower than a king, of a smallish region in what is now Germany. And then he was made King of Bohemia after the marriage. Elizabeth was the queen, so he kind of upgraded himself by becoming King of Bohemia, King of Bohemia, which in those days was a separate country. And And then problems start. A few months later, Frederick got into a fight with Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, what we've got here is a complicated situation in Europe which I don't understand completely, which I'm certainly not going to try to explain to you. But you've got all these smaller kingdoms, or palatinates, which is a little bit lower than a kingdom. You've got lots and lots of them around the place. And then you've got this kind of loose structure where the Holy Roman Emperor is theoretically the leader of all of them. But this is a little bit like, do you remember when we were talking about France? And France again was divided into smaller kingdoms, smaller areas, and there was a king of France who in theory controlled everything, but in practice he kind of had to listen to what they told him. Right? And then later on he got stronger. They had a stronger king who kind of brought the country more together. But this was a situation over large parts of Europe, and which area of Europe we're talking about would change. You know, from one year to the next, or from one century to the next. Sometimes it will be a bigger area, sometimes a smaller area. And it's a kind of complicated and confusing situation. But what you've got here is one of the rulers, okay, Frederick, married to an English woman who is the daughter of the English king, and you've got him having a kind of fight with the Holy Roman Emperor, who in theory sort of runs this whole show. They get into a big fight, and Ferdinand loses his crown. He gets kind of kicked out of Bavaria, and at this stage, James could have said, right, that's my daughter's husband. I'm in there. English soldiers are going to go and protect his honour and protect his position. And he could have joined in with this big fight that was going on in Europe by supporting his son-in-law. James said, thank you, I prefer to stay comfortably at home. All right? And he did. He didn't get involved. And as I say, that was probably a good decision, because the 30 Years' War was a ruinous war that did no good to anybody. Just lots of people died in horrible battles, and in the end, nobody gained anything. It didn't work. It didn't work. Essentially, it was a pointless war. And James managed to keep England out of it, at least while he was alive, although his son got involved. Towards the end of the 30 Years' War, his son got involved. So that's part of, important part of the international relations. And we're going to find out later on that in the early 18th century, the throne of England went to the descendants of. Okay, so it's another of those situations where we've got James. Okay, we've got his son, we've got his daughter. We've got his daughter marrying Frederick. We've got that family continuing on down through, I'm not sure how many generations, I'm not sure exactly. And then eventually, when this side of the family dies out, this side of the family is going to come in and be the next dynasty of kings and queens running England. Okay, so that's sort of slightly similar situation to Henry VII's daughter marrying the King of Scotland, and when that side of the family dies out, the Scottish side comes in. Well, in this case, the European side, the more German side, comes in. So in the early part of the 18th century, you've got a King of England who doesn't speak English. Okay, only speaks German, because he's descended from this side of the family. But that's all in the future. What have I done here? Oh yeah, the 30 Years' War. This is a depiction of the 30 Years' War, just sort of pointless, negative, horrible, violent. All right, so let's move on now to America, the New World, because Columbus had discovered America from Europe in 1492. He knew that the world was round, but he thought that the place he'd come to was India. He thought the world was round but much smaller than it really is. So when he arrived at land, he thought, oh, we've come all the way around, and this must be India. So that's why the Native Americans were called Indians for a long time, American Indians. But, ooh, the tribespeople of America, very different from the Indian people of India, but they got that name because he thought that he'd arrived in India. Okay? And this is developing. Now, it's more than 100 years since it had been discovered. The Spanish are going over regularly. We're getting large numbers of South America, people in South America. Slowly it's becoming a Spanish-speaking area, and Portuguese, Brazil is Portuguese. And in the same way, other Europeans are pushing into mostly the north of America, because the south is still pretty much controlled by Spain. So let's take a look at how that affects England. The first successful colony was established in Jamestown, named after the king, named after James. About 300 settlers arrived in 1609, and then the weather was terrible during the winter. The colony was attacked by the Native American people, and there wasn't much food. So after 6 months, only 60 out of 300 were still alive. But there were 60. It's better than nothing. And after that, the colony thrived. It continued to grow, and by 1614, that's only a few years, there were 7,000 tobacco houses in London being supplied by this colony and other colonies that were growing up, and partly by Spanish traders as well, I suppose, and other European traders. But tobacco was becoming the big thing in London, and it all had to come from the Americas. So 7,000 tobacco houses. In those days, people wouldn't buy cigarettes and walk around and smoke them in various places. They'd go to a tobacco house where they would smoke. That's how it started, and then, of course, people started taking tobacco home with them and smoking at home and so on. So, there were 7,000 tobacco houses in London within a few years of the Jamestown colony being started. And then the next thing that leads to is slaves. Slaves from Africa were taken to Jamestown to help to cultivate the tobacco. And so we start now the slave triangle, which is going to dominate the development of the British Empire in the West. The British Empire in the East develops differently. Okay? It's not based on slavery. It's based on trade with India, particularly India, but other countries as well, but especially India, and exploiting the local people, but not actual slavery. Okay? So slavery is really an aspect of the Western British Empire. And I think sometimes my students have the image that those slaves were taken back to Britain. And basically, no, they weren't. Basically, they were taken to be slaves in the Americas, okay? The Caribbean area, and what's now the United States, and basically that's where they mostly ended up. And yeah, talking about the Jamestown colony, the founder of Jamestown, John Rolfe, is famous because he married Pocahontas, that you have all heard of from Disney. Okay, but she was a real person. She really came to London, okay, later in her life. It's said that when she was a little girl, Rolfe was sitting with her father, who was the chief of the tribe, and some kind of fight started, and she threw herself in the middle and said, "Don't kill him! Don't kill him! Protect him!" We're not sure if this was a sort of custom, or if it was a real fight. Okay, like she's taking that, like they said, when the fight starts, you run in. Okay, we're not sure if it was like that, or if it was a real fight and she really did run in and save his life. But anyway, later on, he ended up marrying her. And this is what the colony came to look like later on. It's like a little English village stuck out there, out in the New World. This is by the late 17th century. It's a small town, but it was actually badly located. The ground got swampy, and when it rained a lot, it got terribly muddy. So they ended up moving it, or they abandoned it and moved to other areas. So Jamestown doesn't exist today, or there may be a Jamestown somewhere. I think there is a Jamestown somewhere, but this original settlement was abandoned. But by then there were other English colonies scattered around the place. And one of the most famous ones developed from what's called the Pilgrim Fathers. And this now connects with the Puritans. Okay? Why did the Pilgrim Fathers, very famous part of American history? America takes its history very often as beginning with the Pilgrim Fathers, although they weren't actually the first. But it takes its history back to the Pilgrim Fathers because it was a fairly large group of people who arrived. Why did they go there? Well, this is connected to Puritanism. The Puritans of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, there was a group of them that were called the Brownists, and they were followers of a man called Robert Brown. And basically, what makes Brown different from the typical Protestants is that he was a Congregationalist. He wanted the church to be organized so that each individual church was independent and could decide its own affairs and policies. So what we've got, basically the Church of England structure was similar to the Catholic structure, only instead of having the Pope at the top, which was the Catholic structure, they had the king or queen at the top. But it was still basically that kind of pyramid structure with archbishops at the top and bishops under them, and sort of a pyramid structure. And what he wanted was a completely open structure where each church made its own decisions, had its own policies, and there was no kind of controlling top-down structure. Well, this was regarded as terribly, terribly dangerous. In some parts of Europe, people who thought like this were killed in their thousands, okay, because it was seen as a sort of chaos for society. And so he was a follower of this idea, a church structure that's just that each church makes its own decisions, each church makes its own policy, with no pyramid structure. And in the end, people who thought like that decided the best thing to do is to go away from Europe, because they won't let us have this structure in Europe. They kill us if we try to do it, so let's go somewhere else. Brown himself changed his mind and accepted the Church of England, but the Congregationalists, this movement that he had started, continued. And the followers were often called Brownists because of his name being Brown. And this is the ship that a large number of these people decided to journey on to America. So in 1620, you've got a group of mostly Brownists setting off for America in the Mayflower. It's very famous, usually taken as kind of the beginning or part, in a very early stage of American history. And as I say, they wanted to establish their own churches with their own structure, and they weren't allowed to do that in England. And in other parts of Europe, they were being killed in large numbers, so they couldn't go to another part of Europe because that would also be dangerous. So they got out altogether, went to the New World. And these people are known as the Pilgrim Fathers and are considered to be the founders of modern America. The whole idea, the philosophy, we went to be free. We went to be able to express our religion freely, and we are taking our Puritan ideas, which are too extreme for Europe, we're taking those ideas to America. So that was the sort of spirit of America for a long, long time. I think it had its effect on American independence, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of America. And I think it's all this is strongly reflected in it. Okay, it's reaching a crisis these days, but that's how it all sort of started. So. Let's move on to James and his Parliament, which brings us back to that topic of the divine right, okay, divine right of kings. Now, economy was a problem. James came from Scotland, which was Scotland's a pretty cold, it's a hard life. Coming down to England, life was softer, life was easier, and he kind of enjoyed that soft, easy life. And he could eat luxurious food compared to what he could eat in Scotland. He could have a luxurious life, and so he ended up spending a lot of money. He inherited a debt, 350,000, which doesn't sound like much today, except that £1 could be a year's salary for some people. Okay, so it's not a small amount of money. There was a national debt from Elizabeth, and that increased, three or four times. Four times, pretty much, in the first 5 years of James's reign. So money was a problem. And most of his quarrels with Parliament were about money. Religion was also on the agenda. And, the Constitution, how the country should run. Now, when James couldn't agree with Parliament, he had a very simple answer. He would just close down the Parliament. Go home, I'll run the country by myself. I don't need you people. If you won't agree with me, I don't need you. And for long periods of his reign, there just was no Parliament. He just closed it down. That's it. Okay, I'm finished. I don't need a Parliament. I'm the king by divine right, so I can run this show by myself. But, the country had established, under Elizabeth and through the Tudors, it had established a way of working. And there were some things that the king just couldn't do by himself. And one of those was taxation and raising money, that kind of thing. He needed to consult with Parliament in order to be able to do it. And time went by, and the country was not just owing money, it was in a severe economic depression. We've got big problems here. And to make things worse, you get an outbreak of plague. Plague, remember, I said you use the French word la peste. It's pesuto in Japanese, but it's plague in English, plague. And Jumang Ningurai, 100th, given that the population was probably about 3 million, you're saying one person in 30 died. Okay, it's not like the Middle Ages when about half of the population were killed by plague, but it's still, it adds to the negative atmosphere of those days. And so we've got disagreements between Parliament and the King, and these problems are going to get worse with his son, and that's going to lead the country into civil war. Oliver Cromwell, revolution, and those kinds of things. So that's going to be the next step in our story. But this is James's story. Economically, he led the country downhill. In terms of international relations, he didn't do too badly, especially by keeping England out of the 30 Years' War. In terms of colonial expansion, it's beginning. It's not an empire, not at all. It's just small, isolated groups of people, but they're trading large amounts of tobacco. They're moving slaves around the world, the planet. They're starting to get the whole machinery of empire in operation. So those are the big points, really, for James's reign. Oh, and the religious thing, the translation of the Bible, the King James Bible. So anyway, those are the main points.